we because this whole lesson is kind of like I said earlier. You're not always going to feel close to God. I mean,
Hmm.
Nehemiah was cut off. Christ was cut off in a way on the cross. Not you're not going to feel that. And you've got these people leveling accusations at you, whether it's Pharisees and criminals or. But you can hold on to those words. I really like that point that you brought up. That the work of a prophet is his word, whether he's a true or false prophet. God will rectify the the words of the true prophet, and he'll cast away, cast down the words of the false prophets.
Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we are continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ, and Why Do I Need Him? Now, in this episode, we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And this is where Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall around the city. And in the Old Testament, we'll see opposition to that work and how Nehemiah overcomes that opposition. And then we'll go to the New Testament and we'll talk about how we as Christians have to face opposition in our lives. So, in the last episode, we talked a little bit about friends and how sometimes they won't understand when you become a Christian and you change the things that you do in your life, and you might face opposition and difficulty explaining to them why you've made a change in your life. So, in this episode, we are going to zero in on facing opposition in your faith. And so that might be of interest to you if that was a problem for you. Now, in the book of Nehemiah, it details how this wall around Jerusalem got built despite incredible opposition from the surrounding neighbors. So, but first, I think we need to ask Caleb, since you're the historian, why was there no wall around the city in the first place?
Well, you might remember from our study on Ezra that they got permission to go back to Jerusalem from the king of Persia and start rebuilding the city, and especially the temple. And that's what the book of Ezra focuses on is rebuilding the temple. It did mention that construction started on the wall as well, and we already saw some of the opposition from the surrounding peoples. They managed to talk the new king of Persia into halting their progress, so the work on the wall stopped.
Yes, that was in Ezra 4:11 through 13, and I'll read that. It says, To King Artaxerxes, from your servants in Trans-Euphrates, the king should know that the people who came up from you, have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. So I remember reading that last time, and you were noting, that you're not going to get any more tax money.
Yeah,
But it also talked about how they had started working on the walls, but as this letter made its way back to the king, they checked the records and said, "Oh, Jerusalem was a rebellious city," so they stopped them
right.
successfully at that time.
Well, and that's why there were no walls to begin with, because they had that false treaty with the king of Babylon, and then rebelled against him, and he came and just burned the whole city and tore the walls down.
Yes.
So now Ezra wrote a letter to the next king of Persia, asking him to check the records and look for the original commission from Cyrus, and that was found. So they got permission to start rebuilding. Well, Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem, and seems like he might have been the response that this king sent. This would be Darius, I think, if I've got my.
Now, Artaxerxes, it says later in Nehemiah.
Okay.
It's kind of confusing because there's a lot of Artaxerxes.
Yeah,
And
there's
Xerxes and
Xerxes
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah. But it seems like,
It's like a lot of King Louis in France.
yeah, it seems like maybe during Ezra's reform or restoration, I should say, that the wall did get built in some fashion or another, because otherwise you wouldn't have seen this reaction from Nehemiah that we see in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, if you want to read that.
Yeah, I can. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven.
So this sounds like a new development since the time that that Ezra was working on the temple.
Yeah, because it was about 70 years, 60 or 70 years since Nebuchadnezzar had burned him in the first place. So
Mm.
I don't think,
Yeah.
it wouldn't make sense to have this emotional breakdown over that when you already knew it happened a lifetime ago.
That's true. And so so Nehemiah takes it would seem like a rather extreme reaction to this news but I think it's because without gates and without walls, an ancient city was defenseless against the people around them, and I think he was concerned for the welfare of his fellow Jews who were living there. And so um, so there's really three things that you need to know about Nehemiah, right? Like one, we've already just saw he started fasting and praying as soon as he got this news. And so the first one is that Nehemiah is a man of prayer.
Right. And that prayer continues in verse 5 and 6. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel.
That's how the prayer opens. And then in verse 11, he closes the prayer, just kind of get a feel for the passion of Nehemiah's prayers and how he approaches God. And he closes the prayer with verse 11, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king.
That's just thrown in as like an aside there.
Well, to who I guess the man is that he's talking about in the prayer.
Yeah.
But he's making a plan and he's asking God to bless it. I guess that he's going to approach the king and talk to him about the situation. And so that introduces
Our second thing that we need to know about him. So he was the cupbearer to the king.
Yeah.
And that's a very important position. We see this come up in a couple other stories in the Bible, right? Like with Joseph is a good example. He's in prison with Pharaoh's former cupbearer.
Mm-hmm.
And your job as the cupbearer isn't just to be like a waiter serving him. You're also taking the first sip in case it's poisoned.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty heavy duty job. I mean, 90% of the time it's going to be super luxurious, but there's that chance that you're just going to be murdered.
Yeah, there's also the possibility, which I don't think the scripture ever says this, but it's probably likely that Nehemiah was a eunuch, because if he served in the king's court with the king's harem and everything there, that he would have been.
That was very common, for male servants in general to have been, made eunuchs.
The ones that serve in the court.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the cupbearer to the king, which it illustrates the point that's made in Nehemiah 2 verses 1 through 3, where it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So
That's a pretty clever plan. If you read between the lines, you can realize what Nehemiah is up to. So remember, his job is to taste the king's wine and food before he takes it to see if there are any adverse effects.
Yeah.
So if your life depends on that, and that guy shows up not looking so hot, you'd be like, whoa, what's going on? You're feeling a little uneasy there? You got some indigestion?
Yeah, you just took a drink out of his goblet and then you're bringing it to him and he's like,
Yeah, and the king mentions illness there. He says, why would you be sad if you're not ill? And yeah, you can tell it's on his mind there. You're
Oh
not
yeah,
ill, right? Right?
yeah, yeah. And so so this is another example where Nehemiah is using his position in the kingdom, to get some influence with the king.
And this also ties in well with the story of Esther, which we're not there yet, but she has to go through kind of this whole situation because you can't just waltz up to any king usually and just start talking to him. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So even when you're in the palace, Esther's the queen, Nehemiah's the cupbearer, and in Persia there was kind of this reverence for him. You're supposed to supplicate yourself. You don't come unless summoned. You don't talk unless spoken to. So he has to find a way of getting the king to break the ice before he can
yeah.
address him.
That's a really good point. So he uses that influence that he has and the fact that he's forlorn gets
Yeah.
the king's attention big time.
And he said he had always been glad in his presence too. So maybe there's just kind of a personal level of it where he's always been kind of a joy to be around, and then maybe the king
yeah.
is kind of genuinely thrown off by that.
Nehemiah, the court jester.
That's not exactly what I meant.
Yeah.
But,
Well, and so he tells the king, the city's burned down. And so, like, what response does he get from the king? Well, in verses 4-6, it says, "The king said to me, 'What is it you want?' Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it.' Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, 'How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?' It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." So,
yeah. So he mentions in verse 3 or which verse it was, I don't remember, in the first section that we read there, that he was afraid because he's about to make this huge request of him.
yeah, yeah. And and the queen's sitting right there too. So that's kind of cool. So he has access to both the king and the
Mhm.
queen. And so, not sure why he mentions that, but maybe he was a favorite of the queen too.
Yeah.
So the king obviously likes him, right? Because he's not just, yeah, sure, go ahead and do it, and I'll just get a new cupbearer, right? He's
Well,
like,
yeah, when you have a good cupbearer, that's somebody that
yeah,
you can trust. He doesn't want to easily give that up.
yeah. So he asks him, when will you be back? I don't want you to be gone forever, but how long will that take? And so the king not only sends him, right? We're not going to read all of this. That's again, like, you got to do your homework, but he not only sends him, right, but he sends letters of recommendation. He sends military escort with him.
Hmm.
So it's a
Well,
big
yeah,
deal.
and obviously, just sending one guy, he's not going to just have the resources to build. He's not showing up with 20 tons of bricks. He's
Mm.
he's he's going to have to. The king, it's implied here, is going to have to support it and kind of bankroll the project.
Yeah. Now notice, we said that Nehemiah was a man of prayer. That was our first thing about him. And in the middle of talking to the king, it says, "I prayed." So
Mm.
he says a little prayer right in the middle, and then he talks to God, or talks to the king.
Mm.
So he's talking to God
Yeah. Prayer,
nonstop all day.
prayer without ceasing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So he's off on his way, and he has military escort. And so the third thing you need to know about Nehemiah is
He's very efficient. And this makes sense because he just set a timetable with the king. The king wants him back.
that's true. And so what makes you say he is efficient though? What?
Well, we'll see later in the book in Nehemiah 6, verse 15. So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days.
Yeah. So Nehemiah got the entire wall around Jerusalem rebuilt in 52 days, which is
Yeah, and that
pretty
also
amazing.
makes sense if you combine it with what we had learned before, because that there was at least part of the wall probably rebuilt in Ezra, because there
Hmm.
probably was something to work with there.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar was this mighty emperor who came to destroy the city the first time, and this time whoever burnt it down probably were the neighboring tribes. The neighboring
Yeah.
more minor powers.
Hmm.
So they may not have had the resources to completely destroy the walls, but they could
Yeah.
destroy the gates, knock a few holes in the wall. And at that point, a wall with a hole in it isn't really a wall anyway.
Yeah.
So they might have had something to build on.
We don't know how long the work on the wall was, like in distance, like the length that it had to be
Hmm.
repaired. We don't know how tall they built it up to,
Yeah, because
but
cities are
we
always expanding.
yeah,
So an old ancient city like that, there's always multiple levels. There's the
yeah.
old city and the old
Yes.
wall, and then a second, expansion.
Some of the resources I looked at said it may have been like about a mile and a half, the entire circumference of the
Mm.
wall, the oddly shaped wall of that old city, in his day. So that's still a lot of wall, and not just a lot of wall, but a lot of people, right? That you
Mhm.
have to organize and
and
keep focused.
and materials.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and on top of that, I mean, it's a logistical challenge to begin with. But on top of that, the whole time, he's going to be attacked and ridiculed and
Yeah.
have lies brought against him as he's trying to work on this project.
Yeah, and that gets us to the meat of our lesson today. The thing that we wanted to focus on was how did Nehemiah deal with all this opposition, and we're going to try to learn some, life skills from just watching how this master of dealing with people and difficult situations handles this rebuilding process. So
Yeah. So in Nehemiah 4, verses 1 through 5, we see when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders."
so this is kind of interesting. So the Sanballat, the Horonite, and he is from Samaria, so he's
Yeah.
north.
Yeah, we saw that connection with
Yeah.
Ezra as well. We talked about
Hmm.
kind of the origins of that dispute.
Yeah, so he's kind of northwest of Jerusalem, Beth Horon. We'll look at a map later when we're talking about this. But then you also got Tobiah here. And the interesting thing about Tobiah is his name means God is good in Hebrew.
Hmm.
So you got a guy with a Semitic name. So there's lots
Yeah.
of connections.
It could always be like we have anglicized names in
Yeah,
our records.
yeah, yeah. It's true, but I think there's going to be some relationships
Yeah,
between
yeah.
these folks
There are
and
family
people
connections.
who are already in Jerusalem that Nehemiah is trying to corral and get them to do this work. So
So the
there's
point is, these two guys are like leaders of nearby peoples, and they're
yeah.
not happy about the wall.
If
But so far, they're just making fun of it. But we're gonna see, like this insult. Even if a fox climbed on it, it would all fall down. That doesn't really. If he actually thinks that, then he wouldn't be too worried about it. But we'll see by the way they act that they are actually afraid.
yeah, it's kind of like that nervous laugh kind of thing. When somebody's like trying to make fun of something, but they're actually kind of a little bit worried about it.
Yeah.
So how do you fight against this kind of ridicule? Well, Nehemiah's approach, like you saw with him praying for everything that he did with the king back home. Now when he's here facing this kind of opposition, the first thing he does is to place his trust in God, and we saw that in verses 4 and 5 up here at the very end, where he's like, "Hear us, God," because we're despised, and turn their insults back on their own heads, and that kind of thing. So. And then the next thing that he does, we see in verse 6, it says, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart." And I think that's kind of an interesting indication of what kind of person Nehemiah is, because a lot of people get paralyzed by fear, or
Mhm.
intimidation. But Nehemiah is like the kind of guy is like, how I overcome intimidation? I just like keep working, you
Yeah.
know. And and I thought it was really neat that the verse says that the people worked with all their heart, because it made me think of our constant theme throughout our podcast, which has been the Shema. And the Shema, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind. And here these people are working with all their heart. And I think that's intentionally phrased that way, saying that they were practicing their faith, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and there are tie-ins with some of the admonitions to the churches in the New Testament. They're like working for the Lord and not for man, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, even though it says though that the wall had only reached half its height, right?
Mhm.
Didn't it say that? Where am I?
Yeah, they rebuilt it to half of its height.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So half its height. So they're only halfway there, even though they're doing all this work and they're facing overcoming all this opposition, and they're still a long way away. And everybody who's worked on a major project knows that the last 10% is the hardest
Yeah.
to get done anyway. But
Yeah, and like we said, a wall with one hole in it is a failure as a wall, and a wall that's
that's
only
true.
like 6 feet high or however tall it was is not going to be very effective either.
Yeah, man, the threats and the rumors just keep coming, right? So in Nehemiah 4:7-12, you
And
want to read
keep in
that?
mind,
Hmm?
this is all happening in the span of 52 days,
That's true.
less than
Yeah.
2 months.
Yeah.
That all this work and all of these schemes and insults are happening.
Yeah. So do you want to read Nehemiah 4:7-12?
Yeah. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." Also, our enemies said, "Before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them, and we will kill them and put an end to the work." Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, "Wherever you turn, they will attack us."
So there's a multi-pronged approach here, but the first one is look at how they had where all these people were from.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm putting a map up on your screen for you to look at. But if you can't see that, don't worry, I'll explain it too. But Sanballat the Horonite, okay, we saw earlier he was from Samaria, which is north of Jerusalem, but Beth Horon, which is his hometown, is right there northwest of Jerusalem. And then you had Tobiah the Ammonite, and the Ammonites were east of Jerusalem. You had Geshem the Arab, and they were from the south and southeast. And then you had Ashdod, which is on the coast, right directly due west of Jerusalem. So they've basically got them surrounded, and then also kind of cut off from Susa, where he would have to go to get connected with the king. Any resources from the king.
Persia would be off the map further east.
Yeah.
So about the only place where they don't have an enemy is to the southwest, which is just the Sinai Desert, and then Egypt beyond that. So not much help.
Yeah. Yeah, and then probably the Arabs might have been in the Sinai Peninsula as well at that time.
Yeah, that's possible.
It's probably that entire southern region was controlled by Geshem, if I had to guess.
So, very discouraging.
Yeah. So then they had also gotten into their heads, right? Because it said that the people were losing faith.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
so
they're complaining about the rubble and the strength of the laborers.
Yeah, and so the plan was working, which that's always discouraging, when you're a leader and you see the people getting discouraged. And then they said, okay, well, on top of that, we'll ambush you. When you're out there working, we'll just come up and, drop a stone on your head or hit you with an arrow or whatever and take you out.
Yeah.
And then, if any of that wasn't enough, they went to their relatives who lived near them, and they sent threats through them too, right? Because it says the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they're going to kill us.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody's discouraged.
Yeah, so it's a pretty good effort that they're making, but Nehemiah had a solution, right?
So, yeah, this is so metal. Like it's just like awesome in a way, the way that they're described here.
Oh, you want to read then verses 13 and 14?
Yeah. Well, Well, I guess I'm thinking of maybe the next passage too, but it's pretty funny in a kind of an awesome way to try and picture what we're gonna start reading about here. So therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes."
So, Nehemiah's plan is really pretty genius because he stations everybody kind of near their home
Hmm.
and has them work in family groups that live near each other. And then he's like, well, you fight for your area or your family is going to die. It's kind of like, well, that puts you pretty heavily invested in
Yeah.
fighting, right, for that
Well, and
area.
building the wall.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
building the wall as fast as you can. So he's really pretty clever in as well as industrious, here, and he stations everybody at just the right places to make the effort successful.
Yeah.
And of course, it says that God was working in there too, and he was frustrating
Hmm.
the
Yeah. Verse
enemy.
verse 15.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, in the next verse. I'm sorry. In the
Yeah.
next verse, God, it shows how God was involved also in frustrating the enemy. So go ahead.
When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work.
Yeah. So so the plan worked, and God was blessing it, and then they were able to encourage the people to continue working.
Yeah. So then this next passage is the one I was thinking of. So he's got an elaborate plan. They're all kind of half working, half guarding, and supporting each other in that. And of course, they're stationed in the part of the city or on the wall that protects the part of the city where their families live and where their own homes are. So they're very inspired to, if he pulled you from your house and moved you to the other side of the city, then you'd be worried the whole time about your family. But he's putting them where they can work to protect their own. So Nehemiah 4, verses 16 through 23. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, "The work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us." So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time I also said to the people, "Have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day." Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water.
So, uh,
Yeah, that's what I'm. It's just so amazing to picture. Like, imagine you drive by a construction site, only every guy's holding a spear and working. Actually working. That would be more shocking than anything.
yeah, sidearm construction company.
Yeah. Um. So it's just an awesome picture and a team effort, and it's more incredible that they got it done so fast because half of the guys aren't working; they're standing guard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a good plan he has. He says the man who sounds the trumpet stayed with me, and it sounds like he is basically running around the city like a mother hen, checking on every point of the wall, looking at checking with the guards if they've seen anything, and if there's an ambush anywhere, then the trumpet blast, he controls when that guy blasts the trumpet. He doesn't want a false alarm.
Mm-hmm.
So from wherever the trumpet blast comes from, then the guards would come to that point to stop the ambush. So there's just no chinks in the armor.
Yeah, so you don't have the false alarm like the Hawaiian missile defense system last year or whatever it was.
I don't think I heard about
You didn't
that.
hear about that? Yeah, so they sent out a message to the whole island or all the islands there that there was a nuclear attack, and it was imminent, and everybody was like freaking out, and then it was like, oh, that was wrong. Yeah,
It was just a volcano.
so anyways,
Yeah. Well, is there a passage that this reminds you of? This,
There must be one that it reminds you of. What do you?
I know I'm getting into the New Testament, but I know we don't have it in our later verses. So I'll just kind of suggest it, and people can go look at it. But Ephesians 6, right, when Paul talks about the armor of God,
Oh yeah.
this is just like word for word some of the same description.
Yeah.
Like he's saying, we never took off our clothes, and I assume by that he means like their armor, their war clothes, or they never like they didn't sleep
They stayed ready. Is the way I
dressed
take it.
down, yeah, so that if there was ambush, they could just get up and be ready to fight instead of having to get everything ready.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Kind of like when you eat the Passover, you have to have your
yeah,
loins girded.
yeah, your belt and your sandals, your staff in your hand.
You have to have
Yeah.
everything ready to go.
Yeah. So I would read Ephesians 6 where Paul talks about that because he also talks about being able to resist the devil, right?
Yeah.
Who's our ambusher and accuser.
Yeah. But when you face opposition, especially strong opposition, like what's the right thing to do? It is to be galvanized, right? If what's the purpose of galvanizing steel? Because steel rusts when it's attacked by moisture, and any steel you use in the real world is going to be exposed to moisture, and so you galvanize it so that it's ready when the moisture comes. And so Nehemiah is like doing the same thing with the people. He's galvanizing them.
Yeah. Well, none of them are working by themselves. Everyone's got a partner. There's a worker and a watchman. Everyone's working as a family unit. No one's just doing their own thing by themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And also he asks them to kind of put aside personal interests and support the mission here, because we got to get this thing done in under 2 months. And then once the wall's up, now you can enjoy yourself a little bit more, go back to your own personal interests. But right now we got to get this project done.
Yeah.
So, all right. So none of this opposition was working. And so that was getting their enemies pretty desperate. So they took desperate measures, right? So they go for the other stuff wasn't working. So how about treachery and lies?
Yeah.
So Nehemiah 6 is a little longer reading here too. Verses 1-9, it says, when word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message. Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me, so I sent messengers to them with this reply. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then, the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter in which was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together. I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands.
He's not really that tactful with them, is he?
No.
Not that clever. No, nothing like that is happening. You're just dreaming it up. It doesn't even try to, be polite or anything.
And he's also continuing to pray as he goes along.
Yes.
The very last sentence there, he prays to God to strengthen his hands. I mean, I'm sure it was difficult to be in his situation. It's you're trying to rally the people. It's kind of like when Moses goes to Egypt to get the people out of Egypt, and things get worse. Like, just Moses shows up, it's like, "Hey, I'm going to save you guys." They're like, "Great," and then the next day, it's like, "Our lives just got 10 times harder."
Yeah,
and they're like, "Thanks a lot,
yeah,
buddy."
I hadn't made that connection.
Yeah. Yeah, so Nehemiah, same thing. He shows up, hey, we're going to help you rebuild the wall. They're like, let's go, let's start working on it. And then people start shooting him with arrows while they're working on it.
I think it's interesting where they try to take him because the plain of Ono is a desert, right? And so they want him to go meet in the middle of nowhere. You've already established your enemies, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to go, out in the woods alone?" Not really. I mean, that's what Cain does with Abel, right? He draws him out to the fields alone.
Yeah.
The devil meets Jesus out in the wilderness to tempt him. So there seems to be
Yeah.
kind of a pattern there.
And then in this fifth time that they send the message, they also have an unsealed scroll in it, which is kind of a little dirty trick. If you haven't thought about what that meant, when they sent messages in the ancient world, they would put them on a scroll, roll it up, and then sometimes they'd fold the ends over and then tie a string around it and then put a wax seal on it.
Well, it's just like an envelope,
Yeah.
If you close the envelope, then
Yes.
then it has to be ripped open or cut open. So if you got a letter from me and it was just folded in there, and it's like, hey, I heard all these terrible things about you. Are you trying to do this and that? And you'd be thinking, who else has looked at this? Like it's been opened.
Yeah. And so they're acting like it was a secret scroll that was sent, but that since it was open, they knew that everybody would have read it. Between everybody that handled it would say, "Hey, this scroll's not sealed, so let's read it."
Yeah.
And so the intimidation principle here for Nehemiah against Nehemiah was that he would know, okay, everybody along the way has seen this, and what he says in the letter there, what's said to Nehemiah is, well, the king's going to find out. Well, yeah, he is. You sent it in an unsealed scroll, of course.
Yeah.
It's like you put it on a website.
Well, I mean, he doesn't really have to worry about that because the king sent him.
Yes, he is good friends with the king. So
Yeah,
that's the silly part of their whole scheme. None of them really know the strength of his relationship with the king. And none of them realize his strength of relationship with God either. So there's kind of like I think there's a parallel, and this story is using that as an illustration. It's like, the strength of your relationship with your king, the strength of your relationship with your God. It's showing how you don't have to fear things when you're a good person who people like.
That's true. Yeah. It's interesting, the accusation that they keep going back, like in Ezra, to the rebellious past that he wants to set himself up as king.
Yeah. Yeah. But Nehemiah, he just keeps working and praying. That's his thing. That's a little nod to our friend Lance Cooper. That's one of his things. You work and you pray and you pray and you work. That's what his mom taught him. So that's for Lance. All right. So, but there's still more intimidation because in verses 10 through 14, it says, one day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, and the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So
that's interesting, because in the letter they claimed that he had set up false prophets to proclaim himself king. And now they've got apparently a prophetess, and some other prophets that are spreading their lies for them.
Well, I think they're trying to make a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they said, they said in their message, well, you're trying to set yourself up as a king, and are using these prophets to do it. And I think that they're heading in that, making it look like that. They're trying to get him to go into the temple with these prophets, and then they can say, look what's happening right now.
Yeah,
He's holed up with them. So, yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, he wants to keep everything out in the open.
Yeah, I think when you start keeping secrets, right, that's never a good thing. It makes you look bad. And I think that was what he was talking about. Make me look like a sinner there is like make me look like I'm trying to do things secretly and hide them, because I have to, because they're bad. But I'm not going to do that, because that's not the kind of guy I am. Like he says, should a man like me, hide? Like, what do I need to hide things? I'm
Yeah.
the one who's doing the right thing.
Right. Right.
So yeah, it's kind of an echo of Daniel in here too. I think it's kind of neat. Like when they attacked Daniel, they used the fact that he prayed all the time against him. So they trapped him, and then they had him thrown in the lion's den because he prayed against the order of the king, that no one should pray to anybody but the king. And here it's kind of the same thing. They're trying to use Nehemiah's religiosity against him. They think, oh, well, since he's so devout, if we have prophets go to him, we can get him to go to the temple and make it look like he's doing the things that we said he is. But it didn't work.
Right. Yeah. He's smart. He's putting everything out on the table. So, I mean, there are echoes of this as well in some of the letters of the apostles, that silence their accusations with your good deeds, so no one can bring anything against you. Like no accusation would make sense because you're very open and always
Yeah.
doing the right thing. So the accusations just don't make any sense. But
Right.
once you start to withdraw, and I mean there might be some applications there for us in the American church. Once you kind of withdraw and keep to yourself, then you're not engaging enough with the culture. People are not seeing your good works. Then they can level all kinds of accusations against you.
And we're going to see that next episode when we talk about Esther and the confidence that she had to walk in and talk to the king.
Yeah.
Is kind of the same kind of confidence we should have as people who know our strength as in the position that we have with the king or God. And so, but back to this episode now, we'd already talked about the wall gets done in 52 days. We finally caught up to that in the text. And so in verses 15 through 19 of chapter 6, it says, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of God. Also, in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So,
Yeah.
like a lot of crazy nepotism going on here of people who are inside the walls with Nehemiah.
Yeah. I'm trying to re-follow that whole network there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Tobiah, a lot of people in Judah are under oaths to Tobiah because he's the son-in-law to one person.
Yeah.
And his son had married another person. So there's just a lot of family tie-ins. I mean, one of the things that God warned the Israelites about when they came to the Promised Land was intermarrying with the people and that's not, that's been used in the past as like a racial argument that we shouldn't have mixed marriages and it's like, well, no, I mean you shouldn't have mixed like spiritual marriages with non-believers and idolaters and pagans because they're going to corrupt you and then you're going to end up having some guy like Tobiah in charge of everybody.
Well, and again, like they're coming to him and arguing for him, saying, "Oh, look at all the good things he does." And I think it's a play on his name, right? Tobiah, God is good, and they're coming to him and they kept reporting his good deeds.
That's all they have to report, right?
Yeah,
because it's all out in the open.
I think Nehemiah is kind of saying by recording this in the book here is sort of like, yeah, I'm tired of hearing about good old, God is good over there, He's like, how many more times can we say good about this guy? It's like he put it in his own name because he's such a phony.
Yeah.
So anyway, and so then of course, good Tobiah, the last sentence says, sent letters of intimidation. So Nehemiah's like, yeah, I can see what a great guy he is.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, it's true. When you have to name something, if you saw a restaurant and the name was our food isn't bad, it's like
never name your restaurant Mom's. They always say, right?
Oh yeah,
it's bad. It's not as good as my mom's.
Yeah, true.
So, we're pretty much through with building the wall, but there's a few things that happen later on in Nehemiah, even after the wall's done, we wanted to cover with you. Just he knows that this intimidation is never going to stop, and
Hmm.
so he has to return to the king because he
Well,
has
that's
set.
that's why they need the wall.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. And he has to return to the king. But I think he even knows that even having a wall, like we just saw with all these relationships and things, isn't going to save them from themselves, even, allowing things in that they don't need. So before he leaves, he does something interesting. He appoints men of integrity who fear God.
Hmm.
So you want to read Nehemiah 7 1
Yeah.
through 3?
After the wall had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their posts and some near their own houses. So we're still seeing he's trying to have people guard their own,
Yeah.
district of the city.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as far as the whole the sun being hot, don't open the gates till the sun is hot. He's worried about an ambush. Don't open the gates until you can see like
Mhm.
thoroughly around, and the day is underway, and no one could be hiding in the mist or something.
Okay. So Nehemiah does go away. He leaves these guys he trusts in charge, and he comes back later. And in chapter 13, verses 4 through 9, you want to read that?
Yeah. Before this, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. Uh-oh. And he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. So that's the part of the temple where offerings are supposed to be stored. That guy Tobiah is just being allowed to live there now. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room, kind of clearing the temple, so to speak. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense.
So it's kind of amazing with everything we saw and all the intimidation and threats. They just let Tobiah like right inside the walls, right inside the temple, give him a room there.
Yeah. And as far as referring to Artaxerxes as the king of Babylon, that's just because when you have this vast empire, you usually have multiple titles.
Yeah.
You'll be emperor of Persia, king of Babylon, governor of whatever different titles you've inherited or conquered.
Yeah, I mean it's a good lesson. I know it's a community lesson that we're learning from Nehemiah, but it's a good personal lesson too about complacency
Mhm.
and how the opposition is relentless. When if you're not on your guard, things are going to creep into your life, into your own heart, and, thoughts and actions and
Yeah.
things that you don't want there.
Well, remember, we spent a lot of time, several studies here recently, talking about the temple of God and how
Mhm.
that's the church, it's our own hearts. And so this guy moving into the temple, right?
Yeah,
That
that's right.
has more ramifications for us as the church today.
And, instead of bringing in the highest thing, like we talked about in Numbers, and putting the highest thing in the camp or right in the heart of your in your own heart,
They
if
brought
you're
Tobiah
New
instead.
Testament concept. Yeah. Huh?
They brought Tobiah instead.
Yeah, yeah. They brought in Tobiah and put him right in the temple.
Sleazeball.
So anyway, um, if you look at Nehemiah's example, though, the thing that you have to do is you have to keep praying. You have to keep trusting God, and that's how you face opposition. So that leads us to our Old Testament takeaway.
Trust and serve God, and He will silence your accusers.
So, I think what I take away from it is just don't fall to their level. You got these people, they're accusing Nehemiah. And like Caleb said, he's very direct, like, nothing you're saying is true. So, all right, thanks. You know,
Well, and
it's,
very open. All of it, he's conducting everything openly. He refuses to go,
hmm
into seclusion with somebody because he knows it'll look bad,
yeah.
and he just lets his work speak for itself.
Yeah. I mean, even if you're like to say, trying to maintain purity in a dating relationship, like you don't want to go run off, uh, just the two of you all the time, right? It's,
Hmm.
it's better to be in, dating situations where you're out with a group, where, you hang out with your friends and things
Hmm.
like that. And because it's very difficult to, when you're off on your own as a couple,
Yeah, well,
to,
it just looks bad.
yeah, it looks
Yeah,
bad. It looks bad for the lady, who's trying to maintain her reputation.
yeah. If somebody
And
accuses you
mhm,
of foul play, there, you can't discredit it, even if it's
yeah,
not true.
yeah. So do things out in the open. I mean, that's the biblical model as well, and it shows respect for everyone, including yourself, and an understanding of who you are and what your mission in life is, and it's a mission that comes from God, and there's no reason to hide it from anyone. And so, yeah, don't fall to the level of the opposition that's accusing you. And don't neglect the work of God, right? And don't get complacent. I think those
Hmm.
are all lessons that we see from Nehemiah. So now we're going to look at the New Testament, and I
All
think
right.
there's some talk of opposition in the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, I've been cheating already.
Yeah, that's true. You
Mentioned
always
like
cheat.
three
He
different.
cheats every week,
No, I
but
do. I don't. I have not been doing that bad.
well,
The
remember
problem
that.
was I knew some things are, are just seem easier to bring up in the moment, like that whole description of them working with their armor on and their weapons.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, remember the title of our series is "Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him?" And so we always try to find the principle in the Old Testament and facing opposition in this case, and how to silence your accusers. Let God do it, not you. And and so we're going to look at the New Testament and see, well, if that's what God taught in the Old Testament, then that's surely what we'll see from Jesus Christ. And so let's check out some passages and see if that's the case. So we're going
Well,
to start. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say it might be a good time to talk about the word accuser there, some of the etymology, right? We've already mentioned like Satan tempting Jesus when they wanted to drag Nehemiah out into the desert. Um, Satan's name in Hebrew, the etymology of it either means the accuser or the adversary in like a legal sense, like the prosecutor.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so keep that in mind while we're doing the New Testament portion of the study.
So we can apply this both to criticism we get from society, like Nehemiah was facing there with all the people surrounding Israel, to our personal lives. If there's a person, a specific person who has it out for you. Also, though, we can apply it to our spiritual life and to spiritual warfare because Satan is an accuser, is the accuser, right along with all those other types of people.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through some verses. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it pretty quick. Um, so this won't be the longest episode we've ever done. But in Matthew 5, verses 11 and 12, this is the Beatitudes, a part of the Sermon on the Mount, just a little short section of it. Matthew 5, 11 and 12. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So,
Right. Well, we saw some of that persecution in Nehemiah, right? I I connected this verse to the opposition they get in Nehemiah 4 because they're not just opposing Nehemiah or the Israelites, right? They're opposing God. And one of the things Jesus tells his disciples before he sends them out is that if anyone rejects you, it's not a rejection of you, right? It's a rejection of him, of Jesus. And so in the same way, right, the enemies there were enemies of God, not just enemies of Nehemiah. And so that's why we can be blessed or rejoice when we face persecution because that's we're suffering that for the sake of the Lord. It's the work we're doing for the Lord.
Yeah, that's great. And I also like the fact that he talks about prophets in here because um, the words of a prophet were a prophet's work. And so a
Mm,
prophet is justified or vindicated by God when that prophecy is true or the advice that he gives is right.
mm,
And so that's how God, and you know that his message was from God. And an accuser is telling lies. And the way that the accuser is silenced is by God not fulfilling the words that come out of their mouths because they're exposed as a liar. And so it's kind of a cool, uh, putting accusers um, and prophets
yeah,
together there.
yeah, that's a very good. That's a really good point.
All right, so
Kind of makes us. It should make us a little nervous since our whole operation here with the podcast is putting a bunch of words out about the
yeah,
Word of God.
well, there's a lot you could talk about in the Beatitudes and in that one in particular, but those are two pretty good insights right there.
Yeah.
So we'll move on. And what we want to look at next is um, Jesus' insults that he received when he was being crucified. And so I'm going to read Matthew 27 through 44. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head, they placed the written charge against him: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him.
Yeah, I find it interesting the tie-in between the accusations Jesus is receiving and that Nehemiah received, right? About being king.
Yeah.
Except
Hmm.
in Jesus' case, it's true. But
Yeah.
there was that open letter that's claiming that Nehemiah is trying to set himself up as a king in rebellion, and that's kind of the excuse that the Pharisees tried to get Rome to crucify Jesus on, is that he was trying to rebel against Rome. And so there's the same accusation here. Some of the mockery saying he's the king of Israel, let him come down and we'll believe him.
Yeah.
And then the sign that the Romans put above him saying that, Christ, King of the Jews.
Yeah. And also, they say, "If you are the Son of God," in verse 40,
Hmm.
which is the same way a few weeks ago
Yeah,
a
the
few
devil.
episodes back when we talked about Satan temptation in the desert. And
That's
that was,
pretty much the same
he says that to
temptation
Jesus.
there as like throwing himself off the temple. What they're
Yeah.
saying, it's
Come down
kind
from
of
the
the same
cross.
one, like, oh, he won't let you get hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. It's brutal to listen to. But as much as Jesus was mocked, right, he just trusts God.
Mhm.
He doesn't retaliate. And interestingly, If you want to look at this in your own time, we'll talk about it in a few weeks when we're in Psalms. But the 22nd Psalm that Jesus quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is actually a psalm of triumph through trusting God.
Yeah.
So if you go read the entire thing, just not the first verse that Jesus quotes, you'll see that psalm is talking about uh, being vindicated by God through terrible stuff.
Yeah.
So
That reminds me, I wanted to bring this up and I almost forgot about it. We talked about Nehemiah being a man of prayer, that's kind of where his strength came from. And we see the same thing absolutely with Jesus. I mean, the whole
yeah,
night before his crucifixion, he's in prayer in the garden.
hmm
And it reminded me of this poem. I think George Herbert is the name of the poet. I'm not 100% sure on that. And the poem is just, I believe it's simply called Prayer. And it's almost a bunch of one-liners that are kind of like clever or different ways of looking at what prayer is. And one of them, he says, is victory by withdrawal or something along those lines. And that's exactly what happens here, right? Like Nehemiah withdraws to pray every time he, like right in front of the king of Persia. He took time to pray. Jesus makes a point of going out alone to pray
Well,
and finding strength in trusting in God.
same thing we saw in our temptation episode when we were talking about James 4, where it says, "Submit yourself to God and
Mhm.
he'll lift you up."
Yeah.
You submit yourself sounds like weakness,
Hmm.
but then he lifts you up sounds like strength.
Right.
So yeah, the strength is the opposite of what you would think. So okay, so what's the key for Jesus on the cross? It's like knowing he was the Son of God. That was the reason that he didn't need to retaliate, right?
Mm.
He was sure. This gets back to like our spiritual vision and our spiritual blindness
Yeah.
episode where we said, the things that you can't see. I mean, I'm sure while you're hanging on a cross dying, you don't feel with all of your bodily senses like you're the Son of God, right?
Hmm.
There's no way you feel that way. But
Well, that's
Jesus
one of the major accusations from other religions, right?
and the people that were walking
Against
past him.
Christianity. Yeah, and right there, that well, God couldn't be killed like that, right?
Yeah.
So
But Jesus knew he was, right? Just and that is what informed his action, which is not to retaliate. They actually are uh, goading him on to retaliate, right? Come down, show
mhm.
us, if you're the king. I don't know if they were thinking about what that would have meant if he actually could do it.
Yeah,
Oops. uh, but we need to have the same posture in our own lives when we face opposition, is to know you're a child of God. Like, think about like what I had just said about Jesus hanging on the cross. How could he possibly have felt humanly like he was special to God at that moment? He couldn't have, but he knew he was, and his spiritual vision allowed him to see that and to understand that. And we have to have the same mindset, when we face opposition as Jesus Christ had hanging on the cross. It's like, this doesn't feel right now like I'm special to God or God looking down on me, but he is. And I know he is. And I know he's going to bear me through this and silence my accusers.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good point.
So cool stuff. Um, you got anything else on that one? And we move on to
No, I'm ready for
okay.
Peter
First
there.
Peter 2 verses 11 through 25. It's kind of a lengthy one. Do you?
Yeah,
want to
you
read it?
read the last lengthy one.
Okay, go ahead.
Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. That's just like we were talking about with Nehemiah. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. There's a lot in
Yeah,
there.
there's a ton in that. And
But
we're
I
not
mean,
going
it was pretty much an explanation of that last passage we read about Christ, taking the insults
yeah.
and
hmm
submitting in the
Yeah, it
face of them.
definitely informs this passage. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I was mentioning with Nehemiah, just letting people talk about his good works. He's like, yeah, they're good works. And if you're Tobiah, your name means God is good, and you can't even see His goodness when it's being acted out in front of you. That's your problem. I'm not going
Yeah.
to change the way I act. I'm not going to stop doing good things
hmm
because you're too blind to understand it.
Yeah.
Just like spiritual vision, like you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many challenging things in this that I don't know how you understand them. Like, for instance, in verse 17, he says to honor the emperor.
That's the
Really?
second time.
On
He already talked about
Yeah.
submitting to the emperor and governors.
Yeah. I mean, but in ancient Rome, like, honor the emperor. It's such a strange thing for God to tell people to do.
Yeah.
And then, right after that, he talks about if you're a slave, well, then be a good one, even if your master is harsh, not even a good master. And that's just like, that's so weird to me. It's hard to
Yeah.
understand. Like, how, I mean, that's an extreme
It's
call,
such a
right?
different society. Yeah.
This is like those passages where Jesus says, well, unless you hate your dad and your mom, you can't be my follower. It's like, well,
Yeah.
honor the emperor and also harsh slave masters.
Or when he says, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do with that?
I think it's supposed to represent the extremes. Like, I
hmm
think he's saying, like, okay, I'm not calling you, for something easy,
Well,
right?
look
I'm
at
not.
Nehemiah. He served a different emperor
Mhm.
intimately, as his
Yeah, yeah,
cupbearer.
that's true.
For most of us, we aren't going to see that kind of a payout from it or that kind of a relationship
Well,
to our governing authorities. But
yeah, as we said, he was likely made a eunuch just to be in his
probably, yeah,
service. Now, I'm not serving that king, right? So you
yeah,
wouldn't even be here.
yeah.
So,
Um, so, but he honored the king of Persia, and we can see him obeying the rules. We see the same things in Esther. We know some of the same things from other historical sources. About the way the king had to be treated there. He
yeah,
finds ways of respecting that and still being able to get across what he wants to tell the king about. And also, when it says that we should not use that we need to live as free people, but not use our freedom for uh, how does it word it there? Uh, verse 16. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover up for evil. Live as God's slaves. That's such an interesting verse there. It reminds me of two things. One, the story of the prodigal son, which we just read last week with Ezra, still has another tie in here. Remember that point of repentance for the son as he realizes, wait a minute, I'm trying to serve myself, and I've ended up being lower than the pigs.
mm,
I should just throw myself on my father's mercy, ask him to take me back as a servant or a slave. I'm not worthy to be his son. Maybe he'll let me be his slave. And kind of that attitude, right? It's not that God wants to be this like domineering, terrible master, but we should have that position of humility, recognizing like we have not earned sonship,
yeah,
but he's going to give it to us anyway. But our approach has to be as servants or slaves, which oftentimes in the Bible the word servant and slave are just the same word in the Greek at least. It's
Mm.
often not distinguished.
Well, you made a good point there. I mean, the father gave the son in the prodigal son
Hmm.
story financial independence or freedom, and the son completely blew it.
Right. Yeah. We have a terrible understanding of freedom today, I think, in our society. We
Hmm.
seem to think it means, uh, real freedom, I think,
Hedonism.
means, yeah, yeah. Real freedom means that you have the right to make choices as they come. And then, but you also have the responsibility of dealing with those with if there are consequences,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the right to any rewards, if there are good consequences out of that. But nowadays it seems like our society thinks freedom is you get to choose the choices that are going to come before you, and you get to choose the consequences, which means there's really there's no decision being made.
Hmm.
There's no actual freedom. You just want to control everything else around you, and have no self-control over yourself. So it's the opposite of what real freedom is.
That
And
was
that's the
really
kind
good. In
of
fact, can I take credit for raising you at this moment?
that's what the prodigal son does. And the other thing it reminded me of is a little historical tidbit from the Protestant Reformation. When the Lutherans and Catholics separated, Martin Luther does a tour of Saxony and to go see all the new Lutheran congregations, and and he finds the state of the average Christian there just absolutely terrible. And then he writes a letter to all of the bishops and pastors that are over the churches there, and he says the only thing that the Christians seem to understand is how to take advantage of their Christian liberty. Like all they know is the verses that talk about alcohol and sex and money in a positive light, and they're like, "See, I can do whatever I want." And so that's something that seems to be easy for us to lose sight of, right? Like we saw as soon as Nehemiah leaves Jerusalem, the corruption gets into the temple itself. And Peter's dealing with it here in his letter, and we see it throughout church history and our personal lives.
Well, and like that draws us right back to the numbers, lesson that we studied so long ago. The
Hmm.
bringing the highest thing into the camp, and that there's going to have to be a purging that happens. And I think this is calling us to that because it says right in here, follow the example of Christ, right? That's what we're called to do.
Because he's the
And
just and justifier from the numbers. That's what we
yeah,
called him in Numbers.
and
And it says that here, he judges justly.
and why do you have to suffer, because there's parts of you that you need to go. There's parts of you need to get rid of.
Hmm.
And like it says in here, don't suffer for doing wrong, but if you suffer for doing right, that's good. That makes you feel good about yourself.
Well, that's how you
It's
convert people too. Like
what's that?
when you do good and you're punished for it. Like that's how Rome
That's how
was.
people see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how you open
Hmm.
like people's spiritual vision. That's how Rome was converted to a Christian empire eventually,
Hmm.
was by the martyrs, right?
Yeah.
They didn't fight back physically or violently.
Yes.
They didn't return in like kind, with hateful accusations and stuff. They took it strongly. They even submitted to death as Christ did if that was necessary.
Yeah. Just because
And there's no answer to that. What's your answer to that?
yeah, well, verse 21 says that, right? To this you were called
Hmm.
because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example. He didn't just suffer, he died also. It's like that's the kind of suffering
Hmm.
he faced. And we have to be willing to do the same thing. And also get rid of the parts of us that aren't compatible with that. And so all of that can feel like suffering,
You
but you
can
have to have that spiritual vision that you realize it's for a greater cause.
You can read the book of Nehemiah almost as an analogy or an allegory for your personal spiritual growth.
Hmm.
Like all these people come in against you, and you're just building that wall of you know I, of protection against spiritual attacks.
Yeah.
And at the same time, remember Ezra's happening, rebuilding the temple, and when we talked about how the church is the temple, Christ, God dwells in our hearts individually, even. So you can look at this as an analogy for your own personal growth and how to maintain that. And it's not always by I mean, we can see the intense work that Nehemiah and the people put in. They're working with swords and spears, weighing them down at the same time. Half of them are guarding and half are working. So there is an intense amount of work. But also, like we talked about with prayer, that victory by withdrawal, there's also a sense of, and right here, with submission to God, and that's how you get the victory.
So it's an amazing passage. It pulls a lot of things together. It pulls in the suffering on the cross with our own walk and the whole story of Nehemiah. So
hmm
uh, definitely recommend 1 Peter 2 for your further study. So now here we are, you're getting to the end of this lesson, and it's kind of like, well, how do I know? Like, I mean, Jesus knew. He was the Son of God. He's hanging on the cross. He knew. He had a spiritual vision that I can't find in my life. How do I know this is all going to work out for me?
Yeah. Well,
And so,
speaking of spiritual vision,
yeah,
we'll go to Revelation,
yeah.
which
So
makes no sense unless you have spiritual vision.
yeah, sometimes. And so how can you know that God's going to vindicate you, that He's going to silence your accuser? So the good news is that in the end, our accuser, as Caleb was mentioning, the devil, Satan, he is going to be silenced. And so here's Revelation 12:7-12 says, "Then war broke out in heaven," which is an interesting sentence all on its own.
Yeah.
"Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short.'"
So that's
So,
like, most of Revelation, the trippiest passages in the Bible. But the things to focus in on there, so the passage that jumped out, or the verse that jumped out to me the most, was actually on the next slide, verse 11. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Right? Everything we just talked about. They, following like Peter's teaching there, right? To follow Christ's example, to submit to persecution, even to death, in following in Christ's footsteps. And by what power did they triumph? This is talking about the martyrs. The they there, right, are the children of God who the devil is accusing. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. You were talking earlier about how a prophet's work is his word, and the word of their testimony is what? What's the testimony of a Christian? Is the gospel, right? So the power of the blood and the word of God, the gospel, is what overthrows the enemy. And Christ's blood, right? The blood of those who submit to it willingly for God's sake.
and not only that, but ties back to all the way back to the Nehemiah story, right? They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Like they went out and worked on that wall, right? Despite the threat on their lives that was imminent. So much so that they were wearing swords and spears.
Yeah, sleeping in armor and stuff.
And what were they doing? They were building a wall that did what? Protected their families. And what does that get us right back to? The Shema, right? What
Yeah,
are you
yeah.
doing every day when you rise up and when you lay down and when you walk along the way and when you sit at home, when you're sharing these stories with your children of faith? What are you doing? You're building that wall, right? That's going to protect them, because you're not always going to be there to protect them. And but the love of God is, in their heart. And so build that wall with your kids and with your loved ones. Make sure you teach the next generation so that we don't have a Tobiah living in the temple or,
Yeah.
whatever other problems.
What was there something on the first slide there?
And I thought there was a cool thing on there that said that the salvation, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God and the authority of his Messiah. What was it that Jesus was never willing to assert, while he was walking on earth in his ministry, was that, that authority of
Hmm.
Messiah.
Yeah.
Nobody understood, why isn't he taking over, and, why aren't we
Militarily. Yeah.
making a battle here with the Romans and
Yeah.
all that? That wasn't the type. But in the end, that's the type of kingdom he does have. His authority as Messiah will be revealed. He will be rewarded for those years of suffering and the hours of suffering on the cross.
Yeah. Remember, if we're treating Nehemiah as an allegory for the Christian, right? You're not building catapults and siege rams. You're not building an offensive weapon. You're building a wall around yourself. Not just because you don't want to be connected with anyone else. We talked earlier about being galvanized.
Mm-hmm.
Needing that sense of community. That's what enables them to build it so efficiently. But because we're not like, there's a little bit of pressure off of our backs, right? Like, I don't have to win the war today. Like, Jesus won the war on the cross, and it'll be finalized as we see in Revelation. That's when his kingdom comes into its own fully. I just have to remain a part of that kingdom. That's all. I just have to hold on to it.
Yeah.
I don't have to go out and destroy the devil and destroy all the wrong things in our society and
Right.
overcome all the temptations and demons. I just have to cling on to Christ.
Well, and because ultimately he is deposed, he is exposed, he is
Yeah.
thrown down, right? And we don't have to do it, like you said. God has our back, and that was true with Nehemiah too. He knew that the king had his back. He had come from the king. He
Mm.
knew the king. These
Yeah.
other people, they just sent him
I
letters,
didn't even think
right?
about that. That makes Artaxerxes in the allegory. He's playing that role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a friend, and that's ultimately what we've been trying to say in all of our lessons. Is it's about relationship, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So like when all those people had Jerusalem surrounded, had Nehemiah surrounded, he didn't care because he knew that the king was on his side.
yeah,
And that's like ties in with the spiritual vision. When the city was surrounded and Elisha's servant's like, "Oh no." Then
yeah,
he goes, "Yeah, we're
that's
surrounded.
right.
That's correct. It doesn't matter because we're fine."
Yeah, that's a
It's
great
the
point.
same thing. Like, you're not always going to feel like you're holy or like, God's with you. Sometimes it won't feel that way. Like you were saying, when Jesus is hanging on the cross, he didn't feel like the king of the world.
No,
He felt like he was bleeding to death because he
yes,
was,
that's
but
right.
he knew who he was.
Hmm.
And it's the same thing. You're not always going to be able to summon up the spiritual feelings or whatever. Sometimes life stinks.
Well, and
So just holding on to that word, like we talked about the power of the word, that's what can get us through it.
well, and like we've said about the Shema, I mean, does Jesus live the Shema? I mean, when you read about him hanging on the cross, do you think he's giving God all of his heart and all of his soul and all of his mind, all of his body? I mean,
Yeah.
he's hanging on the cross, dying. He's giving everything for you and for God, and so he doesn't call us to anything less. But like I said, it's not a pleasant thing.
Hmm.
Mhm. But the key point of this lesson, though, is that we do have this relationship with the King,
Hmm.
with God, just like Nehemiah knew he had that strength of relationship, and so he knew that the King had his back. Well, we know God has our back, and so our New Testament takeaway sounds a lot like our Old Testament takeaway, which is trust and serve God, and He will silence your accusers. And so, and like we saw in Revelation, the accuser, right? The capital A accuser, Satan. God is your defense. God is your protection against this level of accusations that you could never stand against on your own, right? Because they're coming from powers like Satan, like principalities and demons and things. Like some passages talk about, ours isn't a battle with flesh and blood, right? It's a spiritual battle, and this is the top of it, right? This is Satan, the devil, accusing you, but God has it covered. When
Yeah.
we see that in Scripture. So
Yeah. And so, I mean, following God's example, right? He just took it all full force and submitted
Hmm.
to to the suffering.
Yeah, I mean, in the middle of being crucified, and somebody says, "If you are the Son of God, you could come down off of that cross." And Jesus,
He
he doesn't
doesn't
he
need
doesn't feel the weight of that, remembering being tempted by Satan himself, the chief accuser. If you are the Son of God, I mean, he feels the full weight of that, right?
yeah. Well, he doesn't need, Pharisee McGee to tell him that, whoever that was that
Yeah.
leveled that accusation. He already knows.
Hmm. Yeah. And so our prayer for you is that you would learn to trust God the same way Jesus trusts him, the same way is the same way that we can trust him, knowing that he ultimately silences the accuser and throws him out of heaven. And we're going to be in heaven, so the accuser won't be there. And so let God defend and protect you so you can focus on serving, right? Just like the example from Nehemiah. Don't get so paralyzed by the accusations and the opposition that you stop serving. Like, keep serving and know that God will take care of all that. And so, Caleb, how can somebody demonstrate their trust in God if they learn to trust in God? What's this first step to learning to trust God?
Well, submitting to death, right? Which we do symbolically through baptism. As
Yeah.
Paul, I've brought that up before. Romans 6, Paul says, "Don't you know if you're baptized into Christ, you're baptized into his death.
Yeah. So that's how every Christian's walk starts, right?
Into his hands commend your spirit,"
Yeah.
just like Christ did on the cross.
Yeah, you come into belief in Jesus Christ and you're baptized into his name. And that begins your trust, placing your trust and publicly putting it out there. Like Nehemiah couldn't build the wall non-publicly, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
there's a wall around a city. That's by definition public. And so is your walk with God a public thing. And so you start that with a public uh, proclamation through your baptism. And then um, where do we find a safe place where we can serve God? Like these people building this wall together. Where do we find something like that?
In the church.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
got to join a church. You got to become a part of the body of Christ, and then you can serve together. Like in the strength of of numbers, like they had there in Jerusalem, where you have people around you who are like minded, who are fighting for the same things you are, and protecting you while you protect them. So it's a beautiful picture of what Christian life can be like.
Yeah. We always end these talking about baptism, which is a good thing. But I really want to stress again, I think the power of the word. Like I hadn't even, I did have some notes about it here, but now that we're doing it, it's really, really convicted me. Like we, because this whole lesson is kind of, like I said earlier, you're not always going to feel close to God. I mean,
Hmm.
Nehemiah was cut off. Christ was cut off in a way on the cross. You're not going to feel that. And you've got these people leveling accusations at you, whether it's Pharisees and criminals or, Tobiah, the biggest, hypocrite of all time. um, and, but you can hold on to those words. I really like that point that you brought up, that the work of a prophet is his word, whether he's a true or false prophet. God will rectify the the words of the true prophet, and he'll cast away, cast down the words of the false prophets. So as long as we keep confessing what God says, right, as we keep proclaiming His word, then we know. That's why when Christ is in that moment of despair, he says, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting, like you said, Psalm 22, and we'll get to that when we do Psalms. He turns to the Word of God, and the whole Psalms, the whole book of Psalms. You read Psalm 1. David says in that the the wise man meditates on the Word of God and finds joy in it. And
Mhm.
sometimes you think like, what, in Leviticus even, and what part of what we're trying to do with this whole project is to show you, yeah, even in like the overlooked and boring passages, yeah, it's all comforting, it's all happening. So
Mhm.
even when you can't feel it sometimes, that's why it's so important to study this and to know it.
Yeah, it's all about relationships too. Like all those books, Leviticus, Numbers. Look how much they were about relationships, and you never realized it. We
Yeah,
tried to bring that out in our lessons, so go back and watch those.
yeah. In John 3, when Christ talks to Nicodemus, he tells him that no one will enter the kingdom of heaven who hasn't been washed with water and the word. So I really think like baptism and the word are working together there. I just wanted to stress that for this one, because I really felt like it kept coming up with every point we made. In the back of my mind, it was just like whispering.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. That's our lesson for this episode. He's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.